From the Willie Miller Auditorium on the campus of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, welcome to the President Speaker Series. On behalf of President John P. Johnson, I'm Mark Bernier, the moderator for tonight's event. Imagine this: you're on a wonderful aircraft on a beautiful day, flying with about 10 to 14 of your friends and colleagues, not a care in the world and thinking what a magnificent flight this is, and then suddenly your life changes. A mid-air collision. You don't even know where the plane came from. You look outside and you see what appears to be a broken part of the plane, followed by a hole in the plane. And now the pilots are scrambling for a place to land. Your life changes. It flashes before you, and it changes forever. Tonight, the man who survived that crash tells his story with us. Ladies and gentlemen, a big Embry-Riddle welcome for the former president of ExcelAire. Ladies and gentlemen, David Rimmer. Thanks for coming, David.
Thanks for inviting me.
He's a former radio guy as well, so I'll be on my best behavior tonight. I had to think when I looked at the video and the story that was done on Nightline about what happened. This was back in 2006. I had to wonder, David, do you have nightmares about it?
I don't. Actually, I think about it every day. There's not a day that I don't give thanks for my survival and realize how fortunate I am. But I've never really had nightmares about it.
Let's do a little background here. You were a broadcast executive in the 90s. How did you come to be in the airline industry?
When I was in high school, I had two passions, aviation and radio. And I had the opportunity to pursue both of them professionally. And I came to a crossroads where I could choose the airline business or I could choose radio, and I stayed in radio. So I've worked full-time in radio from the time that I was 16 until 11, 12 years ago, when I said it's time for change, and I'm going to now pursue my other passion and do that for a living, hopefully for the rest of my working life.
And you went right to the top. You became the president of an airline. That was a very fast rise.
I guess that should give hope to everybody pursuing an aviation career that it's attainable. You know, I had no possible dream that I would become president of a company as big as that in such a short time, but timing was right. I guess I excelled at what I was brought in to do, and I left about 6 months ago as president.
Okay. There's a lot to cover here, and we are going to take your questions from the audience. Let's begin. There is an aircraft. It's a Legacy, I believe?
It's an Embraer Legacy 600.
Okay. Where was it actually made?
It was made in San Jose de Campos in Brazil.
Okay. This is supposed to be the maiden flight. You're going to take a flight across the country, crossing time zones, and then eventually it will be brought to America where the payment and the papers are signed and the client receives the aircraft, correct?
Actually, the airplane doesn't move until the payment is made and the papers are signed.
Okay.
So we were there for the whole week to deliver the airplane. So that meant we were doing test flights on it. We were examining it to make sure that it operated according to what was promised. And then once we approved of that, then money transferred, the contracts were signed, and we were free to go to export it to the United States.
A little bit about your background. Where did you go to school?
I went to Queens College in New York.
Is that where you studied? Where did you study aviation?
I didn't study aviation or radio anywhere.
Wow.
So I'm sorry, that's not a ringing endorsement for pursuing a degree here at Embry-Riddle.
But you had a love and passion for aviation.
I had a passion for aviation, and actually when I was working in radio, I scheduled my coursework around my professional work. So it's I'm not, my wife always says that I'm a terrible example for our kids in college because I wasn't directed to my education, but it all seemed to have turned out okay.
Okay. We're in 2006 when this happens. The papers have been signed. Now we're in the process of moving the aircraft. You're going to fly into northern central Brazil, I think, because you were in the southern part of the country when this starts?
We're going to fly to Manaus, which was the last point before we crossed the water to come to the U.S., spend the night. We're actually planning to do sightseeing the next day in the Amazon, and then continue our journey to New York.
All right. You're in the air. How long before this happens?
Yeah, I don't remember precisely. I'd say it was about an hour or so. We're about halfway through.
Okay, there are what, 14 people on the plane?
No, actually fewer. There are only 5 people in the passenger cabin and the 2 pilots.
Okay, so it's 5 of you. Up till now, no one has ever survived a mid-air collision and walked away from it, correct?
Well, people have walked away from lesser mid-air collisions, but 37,000 feet, cruising altitude, 2 big jets the way we were, nobody's ever walked away from that.
Okay.
And we were, from what we're told, less than an inch from not walking away from it ourselves.
When the impact happened, you were standing?
I was standing in the aisle. Huge bang, huge jolt. Something I've never felt before in an airplane and never want to again. And we had no idea what had happened. I did immediately go to sit down because the fear is that something else is going to happen after that first jolt. But we had no idea at the moment and for hours later what had happened.
Do alarms go off? Do you hear alarms? Do you hear chatter coming from the cockpit? What's going on?
Well, everything happened very quickly, obviously. You could hear certain alarms coming from the cockpit, the most prominent being that the autopilot had disengaged. And somebody in the passenger cabin looked out the window and said that we'd been hit, one of the 5 people back in the cabin. And I stared outside, and there was part of our winglet missing.
This was the subject of a Nightline story, and David gave a talk sometime after that, I believe, and I had a chance to look at all the video where he tells the story before a live audience, and this is the first time we've done this with an interactive audience to this extent. So, from what I read and what I saw, you look out and you can see part of the wing is missing, but there's a hole too.
Actually, if you want to go to pictures, we can show people exactly what I was looking at the time.
Can we go to the slides? We'll come back to this in a bit. Where folks here will be able to, our radio audience can't fully appreciate it, but our video audience will be. If we can pull the slides up.
So this is a shot of the airplane as it was being completed the week that we were accepting delivery. Let me go quickly through that. That's Ralph Michelli. He's the director of maintenance at ExcelAire, and he was one of the 5 people on board the airplane and one of my former partners in ExcelAire. A reception celebrating the delivery of the aircraft. This was just a few hours before the accident. That's the 5 passengers in the passenger cabin. From left to right, Henry Yandel and Daniel Bachman from Embraer, myself, a couple of pounds heavier, Ralph Michelli, and Joe Sharkey from the New York Times.
This is how many can be on the plane?
There are 13 seats in a Legacy.
13, okay.
13 seats and 2 jump seats and the 2 pilot seats.
Does this happen often where you're going to have a transaction and then there's a ceremonial flying of the plane, or was this unusual?
It's a big deal. You know, you're buying, it was a $25 or so million airplane, and it was a celebration. You know, the manufacturer is, in essence, celebrating that it's off their books and they got the cash. And we're celebrating because it's a big deal to buy a new airplane. These are the 2 pilots. These are the 2 gentlemen who saved my life. On the left is Jan Palladino, who's with the airline, back at the airlines. He was the SIC on the flight. And Joe Lepore on the right, who was the pilot in command, who still
Remember
flies.
those 2 faces and names, because David's going to tell you about what could have happened to them.
That is on one of the test flights of the airplane. That is the winglet, so you can get a sense of the size of a winglet on a Legacy. It's going to look a little bit different in a few slides. Just to show you that it was a very relaxed atmosphere. We were just chatting, and it was a beautiful day to fly, and there was no reason to do anything but really enjoy each other's company and rest after what was an arduous week. That's a graphic of where the accident itself happened on our way from the southern part of Brazil, past Brasilia, and on to Manaus at the northern end. That's literally seconds after the accident, after the collision. You'll get a
Top of that piece is gone.
Exactly, and you'll get a much better view of that shortly. That's a close-up of what we had to look at for 35 minutes. And you could see the hole at the top of the leading edge, and we just had no idea what kind of damage was lurking underneath the surface. But I can tell you that it was a frightening thing to look at, And we were afraid that at any moment that enough air would get under in that hole and cause the wing to fail. An even closer view. And that's another view. You could see that there's some deflection of the wing surfaces and just these shards of metal. And again, we had no idea at that point what had happened. We just knew that out of nowhere we had this horrible jolt, and we're
You
looking at
couldn't
this
hear
wing.
a plane coming, nor did you see it pass. It was that fast.
No, there were, in hindsight, there were a couple of people on the airplane who thought they may have seen a shadow, but I've talked to the NTSB and they said the closure rate, which is 1,000 miles an hour essentially, would make it just impossible to see. And it's really stunning when you think of the size of the 737 that would have been that close. I mean, their wing was basically over our cabin, and you couldn't see it. We just felt and saw the effects. And that's a closer look of that wing.
It's amazing.
When we landed, one of the things that was observed when we were in flight, Ralph Michelli, the wing damage was obvious, but he had looked back from one of the rear windows and said, we have tail damage too, which actually, when you look at how almost surgical the impact was, it would be very easy to have just taken the tail off instead of just slicing through ours as it did. Another view.
By the way, I know this is a minor point. Can you explain to us what those things are that are coming off the wing?
Static wicks. That's they're actually, you would think that they actually float in the air a little bit, but they're very firm. I have that wing section framed in my house.
Really?
Where the winglet was torn off. Constant Aviation in Cleveland restored this airplane to flying status a couple of years ago. And one of the things that they were kind enough to do, because we're friends, is they took these sections off and framed them. So it's a regular reminder of what we went through.
I'm glad you explained that, because I got the impression from listening to you earlier that the Brazilian authorities were very reticent about letting any of this out of the country. Was that right?
It was a long process. It was politicized. There was a judicial component to it. The first thing that happened after the accident was a Brazilian court seized the airplane, seized control of the airplane, because they wanted it available for one of the victims' families to be able to have some ability to get financial reparations.
Okay.
And so that tied up the airplane originally. And then it just sat. It sat for a couple of years, this beautiful new airplane, waiting for its status to be resolved.
Wow.
It's interesting, how they say this about tornadoes, that a tornado can pass through a neighborhood and one part is completely untouched of the neighborhood and it'll wreak terrible destruction on the other. The lens on our navigation lights, unbroken. The bulb wasn't broken, and yet you have this devastation on the rest of the wing that could easily have taken us out of the air. So I just thought this was an interesting contrast. And that's where we left the airplane. That's at Kashimbo, which is where we made our emergency landing. And that was the last view I had of that airplane for 4 or 5 years.
Now, do I understand that where they ended up doing the emergency landing is where they had done nuclear testing at some point recently?
I don't think it was recent. I haven't delved that far into Kashimbo. I was aware that it was extremely remote. There was no cell service. But I did read, actually Joe Sharkey from the Times first uncovered this, that it has some nuclear and strategic history. But
Right.
I don't seem to have suffered any effects of that. And that's from Flight International Magazine, just giving you a sense of what the opposing airplanes, how they brushed. It was the winglet of the Boeing that clipped our tail, and it was our winglet that essentially, it's structural. It's not just something that you can knock off. So it basically sliced the underside of the Boeing's wing. The wing failed, and the Boeing crashed 3.5 minutes later. And
Now, there are 154 people on the other plane?
154 victims in that airplane. And that's an old picture of my two daughters. It just keeps me focused on why this is important to tell and to remember, and how fortunate I am to be able to still be in their lives.
You're beautiful. That was a component that I wanted to introduce, and when we spoke earlier today, I wanted to share with the audience. So in a very short amount of time, your life has changed. This is a compelling part of the story. Once you land on the ground, Brazilian authorities show up immediately?
No, not immediately. We landed at this base, and I think that there was actually very little warning to the troops on the base that we were coming. So I think they were as surprised to see us as we were to see them. An American business jet landing at some very remote military base is just not a common occurrence. And from there, there's no script for this.
Yeah.
And there's no script for any kind of emergency, but at least you're prepared in some ways if it's in a controlled environment. We were writing the rules and learning the game as we went along. And we were fortunate to have one Portuguese speaker on the airplane, because our original plans were to have nobody who spoke Portuguese, which would have added a whole new dimension to it. But he helped to smooth the way for us to the extent that it was possible.
And you don't speak Brazilian Portuguese?
No, I don't.
Okay. So authorities are there, and then this is where it gets really weird. It's not like this country. And if you think that you're going to get bailed out by your own country, here's a lesson in how it doesn't happen. Okay, the authorities are on the scene. They have their own sort of investigation. There's a two-prong agency that works under the Department of Defense. Isn't that the way you explain it?
Well, the Department of Defense...
the Defense Ministry or whatever
The Defense Ministry controls both air traffic control, because they're military air traffic controllers, and they also control the investigation. So there's not a separation, there's no independence like the NTSB has in the United States. And it became very obvious very early on that there was a conflicted purpose to the investigation.
Okay. So once they take everyone, they tell the part of the story where they are examined and photographed in these bizarre positions.
Well, we first spent about 24 hours on the base while everybody tried to sort out what was going on. There were judicial and investigative decisions to be made, whose control it would be under. And we waited for 24 hours for an airplane to show up to take us off the base. We eventually were taken off the base by a military legacy to a place called Cuiabá. We were brought to the federal police station. And the federal police are the equivalent of the FBI. And we were told that we were met by representatives of the manufacturer, lawyers, PR people. We were also met by members of the U.S. government, one of the people from the consulate, and the U.S. Air Force attaché to Brazil. And we were assured that this questioning was to be routine questioning, that they took care of everything, and we'd be out of there very quickly. And we wound up spending the night there. We didn't leave until 6 o'clock the next morning. And during the time we spent there, we were each interrogated. They'll say questioned, I'll say interrogated. And one of the most bizarre things that we were asked to do, a gentleman in a white coat showed up. And he asked us to take our shirts off and to be photographed almost as if we were corpses. And we just assumed that he was probably the coroner or something, and he didn't know how else to pose people. But we were told the serious reason for his taking pictures was he was there, he said, to provide evidence that we were not abused on the base. And the more we got into it, the more we realized that we're in much deeper water than we realized, and we had no idea what was to come, but they certainly had our attention at that moment.
Does the American consulate come into play, or anybody from the embassy at this point?
Well, they separated us into two interrogation rooms, and I was the first to go in my room. The pilots, it turned out, were interviewed in an unair-conditioned room. I'm sure it was a coincidence. Not really. And there was a representative from the manufacturer, the U.S. Air Force attaché, a representative, a federal police officer, a transcriptionist, and a translator. and probably a couple of other people. I was a little dazed at the time. This is only 28 hours after the accident. And what they did was they asked a series of questions. The policeman asked the question, the interpreter interpreted it. I answered, they interpreted it back. And then the police officer did a narrative of the question as an answer, as opposed to there being a direct transcription of our conversation. So this went on for a while, and at the end of this process, I was given a statement that was purportedly what I said, only it was in Portuguese, and I was asked to sign it. And I refused.
Was it a confession?
No, it wasn't a confession. It was, from what I'm told, an accurate factual account. It was just a factual account. There was nothing to confess to.
What, did they try to coerce a statement to
No.
make it look like it was your fault?
No, I mean, some of the questions were just, I thought they were a little ignorant. But, you know, people who are thrust into aviation don't know the complexities of it, so I'll make that allowance. No, I think it was an earnest effort to get facts. But what we didn't realize was that this questioning was the opening of the criminal investigation into the accident. It was not innocent questioning. It wasn't routine questioning.
You had no lawyer, no one to represent you.
We had no lawyer, and we were told, I contacted our offices before we got there, and I said, there's no lawyer here. What am I supposed to do? Because I was leading our delegation. And I was told to cooperate. Because we knew that the truth was on our side. And I guess we were naive about how the facts would be twisted to make it look otherwise.
I believe you told me that despite the fact that this statement was written in Brazilian Portuguese, you said, I can't sign this. Was there an American that told you to sign it and add something?
Yes, I asked the U.S. Air Force attaché. He was a very nice gentleman. I said, I can't sign this. I'm not going to attest to words that I have no idea what they say. And he read through it, and he said, no, this is a fair account. And I said, well, I'm still not going to sign it. And he said, well, why don't you sign it and just write, I don't read, write, or speak Portuguese. So I thought, well, that, you know, as long as they don't erase it or somehow edit what I've written, that seems reasonable. And all we wanted to do was get out of there. So,
yeah.
You know, short of telling a story just to satisfy them, we just wanted to get out and go home and process all that had happened. So I did that, and I went to all the other 6 people on the airplane, and I said, this is what they advised to do. It's your decision, but I wouldn't sign it unconditionally, and we don't know what the risks of not signing it are, so this is the guidance that I've been given.
How long is this period of time? From the time that you land, go through this inspection with the photos, to the statement? What kind of a time frame are we looking at here?
To the time that we left the police station, from the actual accident and the time we left the police station, it was about 32, 34 hours.
Wow.
A lot had happened, and you know, I'd argue that we were probably in shock to some degree, but we were just marching through our paces and again, trying to get out.
Were you sort of incarcerated? I mean, you couldn't leave. You had to stay someplace. Did they put you in a cell? Anything like that?
No, we all wandered around the office. It was actually the first unlimited exposure I had to the internet. I had no cell phone service at the base. So we were just wandering around. They brought pizza in for us because we were hungry, we were exhausted. I wouldn't say we were there voluntarily, but we certainly weren't incarcerated. But looking out, there was a terrace, and looking out, it didn't look like there was any place nice to go. So this was probably the best and safest choice. And we realized, again, the severity of what we were going through. When we left the police station at about 6 in the morning, there was media outside, there were cameras. And again, this is all part of the process of it sinking in. We realized this was going to be pretty deep.
To review, is anyone injured at all in your party?
I scratched a nail. That was when I went to grab onto my briefcase with the impact, but no, There were miraculously no injuries at all.
The pilots are not injured?
No.
Okay. You worry that if the pilots are taken away and put in jail, you actually said you thought they might be killed.
Absolutely, and that was our fear. The pilots were prevented from leaving the country for the next 2 months, while the federal police tried to pin charges to them. And my fear that entire time was either that a very angry survivor, family member of one of those killed was going to try to get revenge on them, or that they would go to jail, where the Brazilian jails are notoriously dangerous, and here you would be throwing 2 guys that their own government is saying killed 154 of their countrymen. And I thought for sure if they were ever forced to go to jail, that I didn't have any confidence that they would come out alive.
During this 36 hours, are you allowed to call your wife and let her know what's going on with you and your daughters, who must be frantic?
We were able to call them and contact them before it even got into the news. It wasn't immediately known or reported that an airliner was missing. So Daniel Bachmann, our Portuguese speaker, negotiated for us to use a phone and to get on the internet. The internet was basically at dial-up speed, and we were at their mercy. We had to ask to do it, and it's not like it was sitting in our room where there was fast Wi-Fi. So I tried to call home, and I didn't actually speak to anybody from my family until we made the flight off the base. So it was more than 24 hours after the crash. I did get an email out to the spouses of all the people on board, just basically giving them the facts that we'd been in an accident and that we're all perfectly safe, because I knew that once the media got a hold of it, that all bets were off, and we didn't want them to worry until they could hear from us.
This is just what a nightmare. At this time, are people panicking? There must be a tremendous amount of anxiety at not knowing when you're going to leave, that 36-hour period.
It's hard to describe. There was no panic. There was no panic on the airplane after the collision. There was no panic on the ground. There was concern. I think Jan Palladino was probably the most concerned, the SIC. BC came from an airline background and a union background, and there's more rules when it comes to that. There's more procedures and more structure. In the Part 135 world, the on-demand air charter world, we go to a lot of places once. So there's not a lot of staff, there's not a lot of procedures and policies. We don't have feet on the ground. Everybody's learning as they go. So we just we tried to be calm and to stay together and to keep our eyes and ears out and to just go with the flow, and I think we were very successful doing that.
In the next few minutes, we're going to come to the audience, and you can ask your questions directly of our guest, David Rimmer, and Clinton Oren will come with a microphone. If you can ask your question directly to him, get it answered. For our radio audience listening on 1150 WNDB and also watching on our YouTube audience as well. Okay, now you're leaving Brazil, finally, 36 hours later. Who's flying you? Is it the country? Is it your company sending another plane? How do you get out of there?
Well, we didn't leave Brazil yet. We first, from Cuiabá, we were first then brought back to San Jose de Campos.
Where you started from?
Where we started from. And we were put in a hotel. We were surrounded by security and people keeping the media away from us.
Do you know 154 people have died at this point?
By that time we did, yeah.
Wow.
We actually learned the airliner was missing at dinner on the night of the crash, which is devastating. I mean, it still is. But I stayed in country for about a week after the accident to help the pilots get set up with legal and PR representation, and to make sure that they're provided for and safe. We spent about another 24 hours, maybe less, in San Jose, gathering everything together, gathering our thoughts, and planning for the next several days. And that's when the other 4 people on the airplane started to leave for home.
Okay, what's the company that owns the other plane?
Gol Airlines.
Okay. Do you end up hearing from them immediately? What What's the exchange?
There's no exchange really until it becomes an insurance matter, sadly. The interaction between our company and theirs was really non-existent. The only time I saw a goal representative was at the military base. They had sent an accident expert to begin the investigation, their investigation. But otherwise, we had no interaction with them at all. Sadly, accidents become something for the lawyers and the insurance companies when all is said and done, and that's the next contact that I had.
Okay. So you're in the country for about a week, and then you make your way to Florida?
I made my way to Florida. Actually, we had a planned vacation in Disney. And so I said to my wife, just go ahead with the trip, and I'll do my best to make it there, but don't promise the girls anything.
Are they in New York?
They're in New York. And so what I did was I left, I believe it was on a Friday, and we hadn't warned the girls, and I was going to connect to go to Orlando, but I was so full of energy and excitement that I drove from Miami to Orlando after the 10-hour flight and surprised them at Disney just so that I could spend that time with them.
What was that like? They know their father's been through this horrific event. Your wife, what's that like?
She had to keep everything together because the kids needed to know that I was safe, and no matter what was going on around them, no matter what they may see on TV or read in the newspaper, that I was okay. I think one of the things that has impacted me over the last couple of years is to think a little bit less about what we went through as a family, because for what we went through is temporary, and I think of all the families that miss their daddy after the accident who are never going to see him again, and it's difficult to process. And
Have you talked to the families of some of those who were lost?
No, we haven't had any contact with them at all, and I'm not sure what I could possibly say to provide them with any relief. I mean, I'm a symbol of I'm a survivor, and I don't know that I would have words to ease their pain at all, but I understand their pain.
David, let me leap forward, because I know that this audience, as well as our radio audience, is wondering, did they ever determine who was at fault?
Well, there were two different reports. The Brazilian accident investigation was a 300-plus page report that spent a lot of time dramatizing what they felt our shortcomings were as a company, what they felt the pilot's shortcomings were, and they made some passing reference, in my opinion, to the role of Brazilian air traffic control. And what the NTSB came back with was essentially that this was an air traffic control accident, and that there were other things that could have been done. There was some equipment failure on the airplane. There were other aspects to it, but principally, air traffic control's job is to keep airplanes from hitting each other in the sky. It was a fairly empty sky, and if you look at the radar tapes and you look at the transcripts, you realize that the air traffic controllers lost track of where we were. They didn't know where we were, and it would have been very simple if they weren't certain where we were to either radio us or radio the Goal airliner, make a minor change in course, and eliminate any possibility of a collision.
In the ABC Nightline report, it was indicated that there was a suggestion or a report that said they turned the transponder off in your plane. Right?
Well, that story was initially spread by the defense minister of Brazil. Because within hours of the accident, or within 12 hours, say, of the accident, the Brazilian government was disclaiming any responsibility for any aspect of this accident. They hadn't even recovered anybody's remains before they were saying this. It's tragic. And when they tried to use the same smear campaign on a later accident, we were the worst loss of life in Brazilian aviation history until the TAM accident that killed more people. And we were inconvenient for the Minister of Defense because we survived and we could talk back and we could defend ourselves. And every time we did, they were offended that we would defend ourselves because the facts contradicted with the propaganda.
Fast forward to us. Tell us at what point either you or your firm or the people on the plane, attempted to engage with Senators Clinton and Schuster, with little response, from what I understand.
When I was in Brazil, the federal police seized the passports of the pilots with the cooperation of the U.S. government. Now, the technicality there is, and I don't know if it's a technicality, is that passports are the property of the government. So if the Brazilian government wanted them not to have their passports, it was really for the U.S. government to take control of them. But they helped facilitate the passage of the passports in the middle of the initial investigation. And they were not returned until we had a court order 63 days later. So we immediately tried to engage our elected officials in the naive hope, because I always believed that as an American abroad, your first line of defense was your embassy and the consulate, and that they would, ride in to save the day.
Step up.
And that is not the way it works. Foreign policy is dictated by Washington. Americans in trouble in a foreign country are an inconvenience for the consulate and the embassy, and they take their marching orders from Washington. So we were pretty well connected. So we tried to engage with Senator Clinton and Schumer and Congressman Peter King, who was the only person who came to our defense. Senator Clinton and Schumer both sent the standard letter saying to the State Department, saying they wanted to make sure that they were looking out for us. But the fact is, I from a political point of view, I understand it a little bit, because we looked bad. It looked bad for us. It looked like we caused this. If you believe the Brazilian government's propaganda, we looked like terrible villains coming in this expensive business jet, flying recklessly in the sky, and supposedly killing 154 innocent people. That's not what the true story was, but we weren't allowed to talk for fear of having the pilots imprisoned, so lies filled the vacuum. And so they weren't sure if this was going to have a happy ending, so they stayed pretty clear. And I had some very aggressive conversations with their staff, asking for their help, demanding their help. I remember Thanksgiving time, somebody didn't call me back, and I complained about it. And he said, well, it was dinner time. I didn't want to interrupt your dinner. And I said, wow. I said, you have citizens who are being kept in a country against their will. They're not in prison, but they were there against their will. You have an obligation to step up for them. And I'll never forget, he said, sir, we have a lot of citizens who need our help in other countries. And
wow.
I was just astounded.
Devastated. What about the black box in the other plane? Does that not complete the story?
No, because accident investigations take so long, and we're still just less than 2 months in. So there's no true facts that are coming out except for the first-hand accounts of those of us on board. The shocking thing was that after they gave us such lukewarm help, on the day that they were finally leaving Brazil, by court order, not because of anybody's largesse, I saw the draft of a press release with quotes from Senator Clinton and Mr. Schumer, with quotes, and I called up Peter King's office and I said, I don't get it. They were relatively invisible for this whole 2-month period, and I was told that's just the way Washington works, unfortunately.
Wow. Okay, what happens to you and the airline?
We persevered. We naively always believed that the truth would set us free, and I continue to believe that. Companies that have had accidents sometimes will reinvent themselves, come up with a new name. We just dug in for the fight, and we dug into a fight to help defend the pilots who were being charged criminally. There were multiple lawsuits that we had to deal with.
A trial in Brazil? No?
Yes.
A trial in Brazil?
Yes. In absentia. The pilots had already left the country for that. But not surprisingly, they were found guilty, as were some air traffic controllers as well.
Wow. This happened in 2006. We're in 2014. How much longer do you stay with the airline?
I left in July of last year. So I was there for 10 and a half years. You know, they say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So I think it made me a stronger person, leader, and you know, in addition to fighting for the freedom of our pilots and the exoneration of our pilots, we had 150 employees, and it was our job to keep them employed. And so we then had to focus on keeping a healthy business so that everybody would have a place to get a paycheck from.
In the follow-through, are you sued personally, or is it totally the corporation that's
Totally
sued?
the corporations, fortunately.
How is it resolved? Did they have to make payments? Are you allowed to tell us what the final outcome was of the trials against the company?
What happened was that lawyers smelled money in the United States because you had some very deep-pocketed insurance policies. You had our insurance policy, Honeywell's insurance policy, Gol Airlines insurance policy. There were hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, if not over $1 billion, available to try to win in a court of law. But our lawyers smartly moved to have all the civil suits moved from the United States to Brazil, arguing that is called forum nonconvenience, which is that the U.S. is not the appropriate venue to have this heard. And a federal judge in New York ruled that that was correct. And so my understanding is that most of the cases have been settled.
What happened to the pilots later? Do they stay with the company? Do they fly again? Do they leave? What happens?
They resumed flying for the company. Jan went back to his airline job. He was on furlough when he was flying for us, and he got recalled. And Joe Lepore still flies for the company, still flies Legacy.
Did it affect sales immediately after? What happened to the financial part of the company?
We were fortunate. We didn't lose any current business. We had a lot of momentum going into it, a lot of airplanes that we expected to add and customers that we expected to do business with. It's hard to know. You immediately get cut off from certain bigger clients because they have procedures and policies when one of their vendors has an accident, but we were relatively quickly restored once the facts came out.
Now, this is a sale of your aircraft to someone else, correct?
No, actually, we bought it for the company.
You bought it for the company. Do they
Right.
give you a make-good plane?
No, all we were hopeful for was to try to get out of the financial obligation to pay the financing on it, and that eventually happened.
It's incredible. When you retired, was last July, I think, you said?
Yes.
Was it voluntary retirement?
No.
No? You were asked to leave the company?
Yes.
Why?
We had an ownership change in January of 12. I was a shareholder in the company, and we just parted ways.
What are you doing now?
I'm
Besides speaking and consulting, right?
I'm waiting for my next challenge.
You got to come back to radio?
No. I think that ran its course for me. I'm planning to stay in aviation.
But you do consulting, I think.
I do some
understand
consulting, but I'm working out a non-compete period. So once that's complete, then I expect to get back in.
Before we go to the audience for their questions, what do you want the public to know? You've been speaking. Tomorrow you're going to speak to some classes. What do you want the public to know? Because you haven't written a book. And that surprised me when your people contacted me. No book. What a story. What do you want them to know?
I want them to, especially aviation professionals and people who want to become aviation professionals, to understand the gravity of what we do, to understand the risks of what we do, and how important it is to take the responsibility for people's lives to heart. Things can happen in the blink of an eye that you're not prepared for, and you have to be able to respond and to prevent to the extent that you can. I've learned about how fragile life is. We don't know what's going to happen when we leave for the office in the morning. We don't know what each day brings. So it really has reinforced to me the importance of family and the importance of doing the right thing. This
was obviously an accident, but did any change happen with the way the business was run after this? Because people always say, could this have been avoided? This was sounds like a very freak accident. You believe to this day that ExcelAire will be fully exonerated, but it sounds like you're still fighting the fight. Are you still fighting the fight?
Yeah, it's more for the pilots. ExcelAire didn't come under as much scrutiny as the pilots did. I think there's always things that you might have done differently, but the fight is now to clear the pilots' names. I'm not brimming with confidence that the Brazilian judicial system will offer them true justice, but that fight continues, and I just hope that that they are cleared.
When was the last time you talked to the pilots?
Oh, I haven't talked to Jan in a while. We text and email occasionally. I talk to Joe still on a regular basis, and it's just a bond among the seven of us on that airplane that cannot be broken, even if we don't talk or talk to each other or see each other.
If the pilots were to go back into Brazil, would they be arrested? If they were to come into airspace?
There's no legal basis on which to arrest them because there's no outstanding warrants, there's no Interpol flags, but the last place that they should find themselves in, as far as I'm concerned, is Brazil.
One last question before we come to the audience. Did I understand that there were some political problems going on at that time too, Brazil and Argentina, I'm not sure, or Ecuador, elections that may have somehow influenced the way the government handled this in Brazil?
Well, there were a few things going on. The first is that we were in the Gulf War, and so it was a less convenient time than usual to be an American in trouble. Chavez in Venezuela was making a lot of noise. There was a Brazilian presidential election, and he was trying to distance himself from the U.S., I believe. So there was a lot of undercurrent, and President Lula of Brazil really didn't say anything about the accident, but he did allow his defense minister to I believe, wage a propaganda campaign against us, and a disinformation campaign against us.
And the propaganda, it's almost like they have their own propaganda minister, right?
Oh yes, very much so.
Now to you in the audience, Clinton Oren has a microphone. Just raise your hand if you have a question or would like to make a comment. Clinton will try to get to all of you here, and you can ask your question directly of David Rimmer. We're going to try to do as many of you as possible in the time remaining. Up in the audience now, you're first on the questions for David Rimmer. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for taking my question. After the pilots were convicted in Brazil, was there a sentencing period, or were they back in the United States in this point, so it really didn't matter if they were sentenced or not? What happened to them after that?
Well, they were already out of Brazil when the trial took place. They did provide video testimony, so they were safe at home. The open questions are still going to be whether or not Brazil can reach in here and enforce any kind of sentence on them. But they were, the most important, our only priority for those first 2 months after the accident was to get them out. And, when we were driving away from the initial questioning that they underwent in Rio, I was with them in a cab and I said, if we're going to get out of here without any hassle, probably right now is the time we would have to do it. So we need to have a conversation about whether we're here for whatever happens, or whether we want to exit from a side door and maybe fly to Argentina or some other place that they're not paying attention to. And we always believed that that the truth would help them. But in hindsight, I realized that was kind of naive. And actually, a senior government official said, whenever there's an accident, I tell people involved, get out first and deal with everything else later.
Back in the audience, your question.
Hey, good evening, sir. Thanks for your attention and being here tonight with us. I wanted to ask you, you just mentioned you are one of the shareholders of the company as well, and I wanted to know more about a short period of time after the accident, how your customers reacted to ExcelAire airplane crash, and nobody know what happened at that point, because we gonna knowing stuff like 2-3 months later. And then I wanted to know if you guys have any financial problems, company-wise speaking.
All right, several issues here. First, did you have equity in the company?
I did.
Did the company suffer financially initially?
Initially, yes.
Okay.
And there were many uncovered costs of the accident. And at that point, you're really just doing damage control. You're trying to preserve the business that you have. You know that any hope of growth at that point is gone. So you really just have to dig in for the fight and hope that the fight doesn't go that long, and hope that things don't come out that damage your ability to fight back. So it's a tough period. It's a real test. You know, I've said to people, I'm a battle-tested executive. You know, to go through something like this, and something that attracts as much attention as this did, and doesn't seem to go away, because every 3 to 6 months the Brazilians seem to have come up with something judicial or regulatory. It's a tough period that tests everybody, but you have to inspire the people around you and lead and show that we're going to get through it, and we did.
Before I move on, did you bring your own black boxes when you left Brazil to come to the United States? Did I understand that correctly?
No, the investigators take those. When we flew from Cachimbo to Cuiabá, they were on the airplane with us, but we never had control over them.
The audience now, sir.
Yeah, Dick Duma with the Border Vistas here at Embry-Riddle. Really pleased to have you here. It was a fascinating story. 2 quick questions. One, the air traffic controllers, in terms of their English, and acceptable English, was there any problems, or would there have been any problems in terms of good communication or bad or poor communication between the air traffic controller and the pilot? And the other question is, on the pilots that you had that survived, were any drug tests done later on as far as the pilots were concerned? Was that sort of a standard practice in Brazil?
It would be standard, in reverse order, it would be standard practice in most places. It didn't happen after this accident. They went through, ICAO requires certain investigation protocols, psychological and physical testing, and they underwent that, and their blood was tested at that point, but that was already 72 or 96 hours after the accident. Language is what's at the heart of this whole accident, I think. Language and training. The English that the Brazilian controller spoke was really not up to the standards that you would need to understand what was going on in the sky. And when you listen to the cockpit voice recorders, they were speaking Portuguese to all the other traffic, so the ability to have situational awareness was very limited. So it was a mess, and it was one of the things, because I'd been on a previous delivery flight from Brazil, I had asked for a third pilot to be put on the airplane who spoke Portuguese. You know, it wasn't regulatory, and I can't argue that it's the direct cause of the accident, but I believe if that request were honored, that the outcome would have been different.
I listened to some of the audio, and when they were talking to the controllers, some of it you couldn't make it out. I mean, forget the fact that it was in Portuguese. The audio quality was so bad, how did they possibly understand what was being said?
Well, that was one of the bones of contention with the Defense Ministry, who denied that there are any radio or communication problems in Brazil. I think the other language problem, if you saw the Nightline piece, was their translation was probably just as bad as some of the Brazilian translation was.
Where are we in the audience? I'm looking with bright lights here. Way back there. Hi, good evening. Thanks for being with us.
David, thank you for joining us here at Embry-Riddle. My question for you, sir, is given that the Legacy was manufactured in Brazil, as an executive, did at any time you and your company consider not purchasing further Brazilian-made aircraft given the situation in Brazil?
You know, the relationship between our two companies got very complicated, but we still wound up as a factory service center for the Legacy and for the Phenom after that. It was uncomfortable, but we believed in the airplane. We believed it was good for our clients. It's a reliable airplane, and as we saw, it's a very sturdy airplane. So we still believed in the product, although we did at times have some doubts about the people.
Up front, your question. Good evening.
Hi. Thank you for joining us this evening. My question is in regards to the actual investigation. Who led the investigation? Was it the Brazilian military? Was it ICAO or NTSB? Like, who led it? And was the Embry-Riddle and the Boeing, was it written in the same report, or were they both separate reports in their very own investigations?
It was one report because the country of occurrence was Brazil. The Brazilians led the investigation. Their NTSB equivalent is called SANIPA. They led the investigation. The NTSB participated in the investigation. And what was so unusual was for the NTSB to come up with such a different point of view on the cause of the accident. But the NTSB's expertise, I think, dwarfs what the Brazilian expertise was, yet they still had to take a back seat to SANIPA.
If you could say that again so the audience can hear you.
Okay. Was the NTSB also a part of the Brazilian crash which resulted as the mid-air collision where the 154 people died?
It was one report covering both airplanes.
Do you think that after your non-compete time, if you were ever offered an opportunity to head up an airline, would you accept the position?
Yes, absolutely.
Back in the audience, your question now for David.
Thank you. Mine is similar in a way, a little bit more on the investigation. What can you tell us about how this might have been treated if it involved different countries? Because I imagine there must be a large number of commercial, private aircraft in other countries and language problems everywhere. If this had happened in India, China, Russia, Canada, do you know anything about how it might have played out?
I can see that question having real great impact because I'm thinking this happened in Brazil, as tragic as it was. Brazil, they're supposed to be our friends. And I'd be more worried if it happened in a more unfriendly country to the United States, but it seemed to cut no muster for you.
No, I don't think it had anything. Friendship doesn't enter into it. There are certain countries that like to criminalize accidents, and there are certain countries that don't like to take responsibility for their own shortcomings. And so that's where we found ourselves. There were subsequent problems with Brazilian air traffic control that they continued to disclaim responsibility for. There was a communications problem with an airplane carrying the Pope that they blamed on the pilot of the Pope's airplane. And there was the Air France crash leaving Brazil going across the ocean. And there was a little bit of a dispute between the investigating bodies and a criminal investigation that was opened into that as well. So the problem is that criminalization has no place in what is truly an accident. It distorts the investigation, it keeps people from wanting to openly cooperate, and it's not in the best interest of safety. But here you have a prosecutor who was in a hurry to come up with people to blame and people to hold accountable, instead of an introspective view that says, what happened here? What can we do to prevent it in the future? I mean, one of the things I said is that the NTSB report did more for the safety of air travelers in Brazil than the Brazilian government did for its own citizens.
By the way, is air traffic control as sophisticated in Brazil as it is in this country?
I would say it's not as sophisticated, the training's not as good, and the accountability is not as strong.
If there had been full-scale, next-gen technology with new transponders, could this accident have been avoided?
It was two virtually brand new airplanes, one of which had, we believe, an equipment failure. At the end of the day, you were still relying on the human element. And it was the failure of the human element and his language skills and his training and his ability, that's something you can't take out of this accident.
Let's go back in the audience. Good evening.
We're squirming here. We're a couple of retired flight attendants, so we have questions. It was about TCAS, which you're sort of semi-answering right now, that I thought it was mandatory in the United States. It was passed I think it was before 2006.
Well, it is mandatory, and both airplanes were equipped with TCAS. What happened was that there was some failure that was never really investigated thoroughly with our transponder. You need a functioning transponder for TCAS to work.
So your
So
aircraft-
both airplanes need to talk to each other.
And what about the 737?
The 737's equipment was working fine. The equipment on our airplane was not.
Oh.
If they don't talk to each other, then they can't avoid each other.
I
It picks up each transponder picks up the other with TCAS.
Okay, I was thinking in terms of the 737 should have had some go up, go down.
Not without our transponder functioning
And
properly.
what was your altitude when this happened to you?
37,000 feet.
Whoa. And how long did it take you to actually put it down?
35 minutes.
The longest 35 minutes of your life, I think.
Yes, very long 35 minutes where you're completely not in control of whether or not you're going to survive. You have no idea what the future holds. I had to push thoughts of my family and my kids out of my head and just focus at what was right at hand and just hope that something didn't happen that we weren't expecting. It would have been quick, but there would have been nothing that could be done if the airplane failed.
You mentioned a New York Times reporter. Did he write the first story about it?
He did. He wrote the definitive story about it on the front page of the New York Times. We had invited, it was one of my publicity goals to have Joe Sharkey write about our company. So when we were taking delivery of this airplane, I talked with our publicist, Lisa Hendrickson, and I said I would love to invite Joe to come along. And he actually wrote for a trade magazine first, and the New York Times was incidental to his presence on the airplane. And so Joe agreed to come with us, and we spent a lot of time with Joe. And after thinking of my kids and my wife after the impact, then I thought, and we have a New York Times reporter on board, how is this going to look? And when you look at the makeup of the people on the airplane, the two people who wouldn't normally be part of this trip, Joe Sharkey and Daniel Bachmann, our Portuguese speaker, played integral roles that were just invaluable to us. Joe had if we were doing anything wrong, Joe would have written that on the front page of the New York Times. So for whatever reason, these two people were meant to be with us and to help lead us out.
Subsequently, did you testify, or did Sharkey testify
We
in any trials?
No, we weren't asked to testify in any trials. I was interviewed by the NTSB. I don't think Joe was. We haven't performed any real official functions as witnesses to the accident.
Back in the audience, your question. Good evening.
Thank you for being with us, Mr. Zimmerman. Since the accident, has the Brazilian government or the military who does the ATC function, have they made any procedural changes or any regulatory changes as lessons learned?
I'm told there have been some changes in the Brazilian air traffic control system with respect to training and language ability and accountability, but I don't feel they ever took responsibility for it. So for them to make huge changes would be an acknowledgement of their responsibility. So I don't think you would see that in a very obvious way.
Back here.
Hi again. My next question is in reference to the control surfaces of the actual airplane. I know that the majority of ExcelAire is completed in Brazil. And you said that you had done just a previous transaction in Brazil. Is that correct? Okay. So you have flown in a lot of ExcelAires. Now, what my question is when you were actually hit, did you instantly notice a change in the control surfaces and how the aircraft was operating, or did the pilots do? Because I know it was they took off the autopilot, and they were doing the best job that they could with controlling it. Was there a major difference in comparison to the regular operation of the aircraft?
It was amazing from a passenger's point of view. The airplane, other than the jolt and a little bit of correction, continued to fly, and you wouldn't have known anything was wrong. But I'm told that the pilots had 90% control deflection to stay straight and level. So, you know, that's why I view them as my heroes. I mean, you don't train for this in the simulator. There's no way to prepare for this. So it was their airmanship and the strength of this airplane, and luck or divine intervention that allowed us to survive. There's really no way, when you look at the two airplanes and how close we were and how close we came to dying in this accident. This is just not a survivable event.
Back upstairs. Hello.
Hey, once again, I just wanted to give you guys more information about the Brazilian ATC. I'm actually Brazilian, and I'm a student here at Embry-Riddle, and I can tell you that they really experience a lot of problems down there with controllers speaking English, communication. I think they took about 2 days to find the Go airplane in the middle of the Amazon, because if I'm not mistaken, that was an area that didn't have radar, so it's pretty much a black hole in the sky. They're only talking by radio, but they don't have a precise radar location.
Well, this is one of the points of frustration. The Brazilian government denied that there are any so-called black holes in radar and radio coverage, and there just are. You know, they found the wreckage relatively quickly, but I think so much of the truth was obscured by these denials, and you know, you should expect a certain amount of consistency in air traffic control capabilities from country to country, especially ICAO signatories, and it's just not what we experience, and it's unfortunate, and I hope that behind the scenes that there is more corrections being done than we're aware of.
Did your relationships change at the airline after the accident?
No, it didn't really. I guess I should ask you what kind of relationships among
With
executives?
Yeah, among executives. How did the board treat you? Were you okay?
I think we were all just so focused on survival that we just continued to do business as usual. You know, there were a couple of us who were largely dedicated to dealing with the accident, and I was the public face of the company. And that took up a lot of my time right after the accident. But, you know, I think people were a little bit reluctant to ask questions because they were afraid it was too personal. But you know, I find telling the story cathartic, and even after all this time, when the survivors get together, we spend a lot of time rehashing and talking about it. And
Do you get together once a year at least?
Several of us used to. It's gotten tougher with our schedules, but we all remember each other on the day, and we text or email one another, and for the most part, we stay in close touch, especially around the anniversary.
Way back, your question for David.
One more question for you, sir. How is your safety culture? I know you're not present anymore, unfortunately, but how did your safety culture change in the years after the accident, particularly with regard to the transponder?
Particularly with what? I'm sorry.
Particularly with regard to the transponder that wasn't functioning properly on your airplane.
Well, we always had a strong safety culture. I think one of the biggest changes that we made was in how we exercised our emergency response plan. You know, it had been a document on a shelf, and we've made it more of a living and exercise document so that we could be prepared in the event that something happened again. We renewed our focus on international training, and with respect to the transponder failing, there are some things that you can't prepare for and wouldn't typically have those kind of tragic consequences. So I think that would be hard to, you can't prepare for every eventuality. You just try to make sure that you're doing the best you can, and that you can go to sleep at night knowing that you've done everything you can to keep your people safe.
Time for one more question. Yes.
Yeah, I think the time frame, I'm just interested in that, in the sense that Brazil was certainly trying to apply or applying for the Olympic situation. And certainly they would not like to have any bad publicity. I don't know what ultimately occurred as far as publicity in the newspapers and how it was described. But certainly I would think I'd be concerned in terms of going to the Olympics down there with the problems that might exist as far as air traffic controllers are concerned. And I think that's one major message you were talking about. You were giving different messages to audiences or people, that when you're flying a plane in a foreign country, you better really have a pretty good understanding maybe of what you might have to be dealing with as far as languages are concerned.
I agree, and I think there's so much safety built into the system that you just need this chain of events to be unbroken to lead to what happened to us. But I don't think you can be too cautious. So 3 out of the 5 of us on the airplane asked for a third pilot to be on board, and that request was rejected. I think that's probably one of my biggest regrets, that there was something in our guts, and I had the least aviation experience of the 3 people who asked, but there was something in our gut that was saying, we need this added level of insurance, not because our pilots were incapable of doing this flight successfully, not because we had any doubts in the airplane, but we doubted the system. And, were I to do it again, I would listen to my gut a little bit more closely. But there's risk in everything we do. It's just a question of how you manage it and prepare for it.
Before we showcase our next program in a week, I want to thank Clinton Oren, who's worked with us for the last few years on this President Speaker Series. He's concluding his assignment along these lines. Thank you, Clinton, for the good work you've done. Richard Weekley, who continues to run audio for us and trains the new people that work with us. Thank you for being with us tonight. John Warab is the executive producer for our radio program and broadcast. I thank him for his good work, and for all of you who took the night and time to come and to hear this testimony and story. And tomorrow, David Rimmer will be speaking at several classes here at Embry-Riddle. Our next event is coming up next week. It's on February 5th, and it's going to deal with, if we can show them the image, there we go, unmanned aerial systems. And we're doing this from a very different standpoint. We're going to talk with Charles Reinholtz, who's the professor and chair of the mechanical engineering, about unmanned systems, drones, robotics, and we're adding an ethical component for the first time. Dr. Anka Arnad, who is an ethicist and associate professor, will join us in a sidebar conversation about the ethics of invention and deployment and usage. This is the opening salvo to a whole series we're going to do in the fall that begins with ethics. So please come back and join us. Tell your friends, free and open to the public, next Wednesday night, February 5th, right here in the Gail Lemron Auditorium here at Embry-Riddle. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, an applause and appreciation for our guest, David Rimmer. Thank you so much for being here. Have a very pleasant evening.